breath had started coming in counts. That is the first thing. Before the hunger, before the dark, before the fiddle went quiet. A 10-year-old girl in a board house on the Dakota Prairie had started counting her own breaths, because counting was the only way to know she was still doing it. Her name was Carrie. She was the smallest body in that house, and by the back end of the longest winter the American plains have on record, her body had nothing left to give the cold, and the cold was still taking. I need to tell you something before we go any further, because if you grew up with the books, or the show, or even just the cultural memory of a cozy prairie family pulling together by lamplight, what you were told about this winter is not a lie. But it is a kindness, and the kindness cost something. The kindness cost a 10-year-old her lungs. For the rest of her life. You know the story the way it was given to you. The blizzards, the hay twisted into sticks because the coal ran out, the small brown loaves of bread. Pa's fiddle is going quiet. A brave young man on a sled riding out across the storm to bring back wheat. Christmas, when it finally came, coming in May. That is the version a grandmother wrote down for children 60 years after she lived through it. And she wrote it beautifully. She wrote it the way you write the worst thing that ever happened to you when the people reading it are 8 years old and need to sleep tonight. But here is what she could not put in a children's book. For 7 months, from the middle of October 1880 to the end of April 1881, the brand new town of Smet, Dakota Territory, was cut off from the living world. Not one train got through from January to May. The coal ran out, the kerosene ran out, the food ran out. 9 people were living in the Ingalls household that winter, by the worst of it. 6 of them Ingalls', 3 of them are a neighbour family with an infant, all of them pressed into rooms. The wind came through as if the walls were not there. And when the historians and the meteorologists went back a few years ago and checked what really happened against the railroad logs and the storm records and the death counts, they came to a quiet, chilling conclusion. The real winter was worse than the one in the book. Worse than Laura, writing it down in her 70s for children, ever let herself say, and the person who kept every one of those people breathing, who ground the wheat by hand, who twisted the hay, who cut the last of the food into smaller and smaller portions, who never once let the children see that she was afraid. That person was not Pa. The legend went to Pa. The legend went to the 2 young men who rode out for the wheat. This is the story of the ones who survived it from inside the house, day after day, getting weaker and were never given credit for it. Over the next hour or so, I'm going to walk you through what that winter actually was. Not the cozy version, the one the records remember. We're going to talk about how it started, with a warning nobody wanted to believe, about the day the train stopped and the town realised nobody was coming, about the labour that has no name and no legend, performed mostly by a woman whose name you have probably never heard spoken out loud, about what months of cold and hunger does to a human body, and specifically to the smallest one in that house, about the ride that became the legend, and the months of invisible work that actually saved the town, about the part of the story the book leaves out entirely, the part that came after the spring, when the snow turned to water and killed more people than the winter had, and about the woman at the centre of all of it, who had been forged her entire life for exactly this, and who never got the chapter with her name on it. Turn the lamp down. It begins, the way it always begins out there, with a sky that looked like nothing at all. Start with the book, because almost everyone does. For a lot of readers, The Long Winter is the best of the 8 Little House books. It is the one where the cozy stops. The family has left the creek and the prairie behind and come to a raw new railroad town on the open Dakota plains. A fall blizzard arrives far too early. An old man warns them that the hard winters come in 7s, and this is the 7th. Pa moves the family from the claim shanty into town. The storms come and keep coming. The trains stop. The town runs out of everything. A long, grinding, hungry darkness sets in that does not lift until spring. 2 young men ride out into the white to find wheat. The family survives. Christmas, when it finally comes in May. That is the book. Now here is the strange and true thing about it. Laura wrote that book in her early 70s, more than half a century after the winter it describes. And one of the most startling facts about the long winter, the kind of fact that ought to stop you cold when you learn it, is how accurate it is. Historians have checked her against the record. Meteorologists have checked her against the weather data. In 2020, a team of climate scientists led by a researcher named Barbara Mays Boosted at the University of Nebraska published a paper in the Bulletin of the American Meteorological Society that went back through that winter in obsessive detail. And what they found, again and again, was that the woman writing from memory, 60 years on, had remembered it almost exactly right. The number of blizzards, the relentlessness of them, the depth and the duration of the cold, the snow that did not melt between storms but only stacked. She had gotten it right, not approximately, closely. A winter like that does not blur in the memory of someone who barely lived through it. Stay with me here, because this is the part that matters. The book is accurate about the weather. The book is accurate about the sequence of events. The book is accurate about the things that happened to the family. And the book is still, at the same time, the soft version. Not because Laura lied. Because a children's book has rules, and the rules are the whole point of this story. You can frighten a child, a little, in a book. You cannot let a child despair. So in the book, Pa stays steady, Ma stays calm. The hunger is real, but it is bearable, and there is always, somewhere near the end of the chapter, a small mercy, a twist of hay that catches, a handful of wheat, a song. The book ends in warmth and light and a barrel of Christmas treats finally pried open in May. It had to. That is what the form requires. So Laura kept things out. She kept out how close it actually came. She kept out the real arithmetic of the food. She kept out what months of cold and want does to a body that was already thin, and which body in that house it nearly took. She kept out her own fear, mostly, and almost entirely she kept out her mother's. The book is not a lie. It is a kindness. It is the version a grandmother tells so that the children can sleep. The record is not a kindness, and it is the record we are following tonight. The real event has a plain, hard name that historians use instead of the storybook one. The hard winter of 1880 to 1881. It began on the 15th of October, 1880, with a blizzard that came down across southeastern Dakota Territory, weeks before anyone had laid in supplies, and it did not truly let go until April. Across that whole stretch of the northern plains, snow fell and drifted and packed, until it buried the one thing those new little prairie towns depended on for their lives, the railroad. The cuts filled faster than crews could dig them out. In places, the companies simply gave up and pulled their men off the line until spring, which was, in plain terms, a decision to leave whole towns to feed and warm themselves or not. And the floods that came after the thaw, when all that snow turned to water at once, those washed out riverside towns and drowned more people than the blizzards themselves had. We will come back to that. The death toll for the winter as a whole was never fully counted. Out on the isolated claims, people simply died and were found later or were not. Into the middle of that, put a brand new town that barely existed yet. To Smet, in the autumn of 1880, was raw lumber and hope. A row of false front wooden buildings thrown up along a railroad that had only just arrived, on a treeless sweep of Dakota Prairie, with the wind coming across it from the north, with nothing in 100 miles to slow it down. The railroad was the town's lifeline and its only reason for being. Everything the settlers needed to survive a winter, coal, kerosene, flour, came in on the cars from the east. The town had been built on the quiet assumption that the cars would keep coming. For 7 months they would not, and into the middle of that put the Ingallses. By that autumn, the family was 9 years and several failed starts removed from the cozy Wisconsin cabin of the first book. Charles, the father, restless as ever, had taken work with the railroad and filed on yet another claim, this one just outside the new town site. Carolyn, the mother, was 40, careful, tired, and holding the family together the way she always had by sheer unbroken discipline. There were 4 daughters, Mary, the eldest, 15, and a year into total blindness. Laura, 13, the strong one, the one who could keep up with Pa, Carrie, 10, the small one, the sickly one, the one whose body had never had anything to spare, and Grace, the baby, just 3 years old, too young to understand any of what was coming. That was the household the winter was about to close its hand around. 6 of them by blood, and before it was over, neighbours crowded in too, until there were more of them than the little rooms were built to hold, all trying to stay alive inside walls that the wind went through as if they were paper. The first sign of it came in October, on a day that started out looking like nothing at all, and the person who saw it coming first was not in the family. He was an old man passing through, and what he told them nobody wanted to believe. The frontier did not send telegrams about what was coming, it sent signs, and you learned to read them, or you did not survive long enough to learn anything else. That autumn, the signs were wrong in a way that made the old hands quiet. The muskrats out on the sloughs built their houses with walls far thicker than any ordinary year. The geese and the ducks came through early, flying high and fast and not stopping, the way birds move when they are not migrating so much as fleeing. Charles Ingalls had spent his whole life outdoors, and he read those walls and that sky the way another man reads a letter. What he read worried him enough that he started moving the family's plans around it. Understand what kind of place he was reading those signs in, because the newness of the town is part of the danger. De Smet had barely existed a year. It had been thrown up along the Chicago and Northwestern's new line across Dakota Territory, one of a string of raw railroad towns that the company laid down at regular intervals as the track pushed west, each one a gamble that settlers would come and a community would grow. The Ingallses were among the very first people there. Charles had worked for the railroad, then filed his claim and set up in the new town, the way thousands of families bet their futures on these instant settlements that the railroad conjured out of empty prairie. And the whole bet rested on one silent assumption that no one examined too closely in the easy months, that the line that made the town would keep the town supplied. A year-old town has no deep roots, no stores of community memory about how bad the winters get, no reserves laid by from seasons past. It has only what the last train brought. It was the most modern thing on the prairie, a town summoned into being by a railroad, and it was about to discover exactly how fragile that made it. And then, in the book, and in the family's memory, there is the old man. An old native man came into the new town that fall, the story goes, and said a thing the settlers did not want to hear. He told them the winters on this land ran in a long cycle, that every so often there came a winter of 7 months of blizzards, and that this was the year for it. Whether it happened exactly as Laura later set it down, we cannot prove. The historical record is thin on the specifics of that encounter, and the story has the shape of a story. The warning that turns out to be true, the stranger who knew what the newcomers did not. What we can say is that the warning, real or remembered, named something true. The people who had lived on that land the longest knew what the newcomers did not. That this country, which looked so gentle and so empty in summer, was capable of a winter that could erase you. The first blizzard proved the warning right almost at once. It came on the 15th of October 1880, weeks before any sensible winter should begin, while the gardens were barely in, and no one had laid up a real store of anything. It was not a storm you waited out by the fire with the season's supplies stacked in the lean-to. It was a storm that arrived before the supplies did, and when it cleared, the deeper cold came in behind it and did not leave. Charles understood what the early blizzard meant faster than most, and he made the decision that probably saved their lives. The family had a claim shanty out on the open prairie. A thin little building a winter like this would have peeled apart in a week. He had also built a store building in the new town, so before the worst set in, he loaded the family and what they had, and moved them off the claim and into the town building, where at least the structures stood close together, and a person could, in theory, get from one door to another without dying in the dark between them. Think about what that move already tells you. A careful man reading the signs did not believe the claim would keep his family alive through what was coming, and he was right not to. They went into town to survive, and even in town, even huddled into the heart of the settlement, the winter very nearly took them anyway. Caroline packed that household and moved it without, as far as any record shows a single word of complaint. This is the thing about her that the book's gentle into the background, and the record keeps bringing forward. The decisions were Charles's, the dreams were Charles's, the restlessness that had dragged this family across half a continent was Charles's. But the labour of actually surviving each consequence of those decisions, the packing and the rationing and the keeping of small children warm and fed and calm inside whatever four walls the latest gamble had landed them in, that was Caroline's. Every time. She moved her blind daughter and her sickly daughter and her baby into a board building in a town that did not yet have the supplies to last, and she set about making it hold. It would have to hold for 7 months, and the storms had only just begun to find their rhythm. For a few weeks the town told itself a comfortable story, the way towns do. One bad October storm did not mean a bad winter. The trains were still running. The shelves still had goods on them. November would settle down. November did not settle down. The blizzards came back, and then they came back again, and somewhere in there the pattern set in that would define the whole winter. A storm of 2 or 3 days. A short, hard, bright cold spell. And then another storm, with the snow never melting in between but only stacking, drift on drift, higher against the buildings and deeper across the one thing the town could not afford to lose. The railroad was the lifeline, and the railroad began to lose. It is worth understanding what the men of the line were actually up against, because it was not laziness, and it was not for lack of trying. The trains ran through cuts, channels dug through the rises in the land, and those cuts filled with packed wind-driven snow that set up nearly as hard as ice. Crews went out with shovels and with the crude snowplows of the day and dug them clear, and the next blizzard filled them back in, sometimes deeper than before, sometimes in a single night. They would dig a cut open, run a train through, and watch the storm close it behind them like water closing over a stone. The effort it took to move one train grew and grew until it stopped making any sense at all. And then, in January, the railroad made the only decision left to make, and it was a brutal one. The company stopped trying. It pulled its crews off the line and announced there would be no more trains until spring. Sit with what that sentence meant to the people on the receiving end of it. It meant that whatever was in your town on the day the train stopped was all there was going to be for months, with no way to know how many. It meant no more coal coming, in a country with no trees to cut. It meant no more kerosene for the lamps as the days shrank to their shortest and darkest. And it meant no more flour, in a town that grew almost none of its own food and had been built on the assumption it would never have to. The railroad had not just stopped running. It had, in effect, informed a settlement full of families that they were on their own, and that the nearest help was a frozen impossibility away. The Ingallses heard that news the same as everyone else, and the same as everyone else they did the arithmetic. What was in the house? How long it could be stretched? How many weeks of winter were still, certainly to come? The numbers did not work. They were never going to work. The whole town was now living on a sum that came up short, and everyone in it knew the sum, and the only question left was how to lose the difference slowly enough to survive it. You can feel, in the record of those weeks, the moment the winter stopped being a hardship and became a blockade. Before the train stopped, you were enduring weather. After they stopped, you were cut off, with the cold itself for an enemy. And no relief possible until the season chose to let go, and it had only just turned January. The worst of the cold and the longest stretch of the dark were still in front of them. The first thing the blockade came for was warmth, because the coal was already running low, and when the coal was gone, the question became very simple and very old. What do you burn in a treeless country to keep from freezing when there is nothing left to burn? The answer the town arrived at was hay, and the answer tells you how far things had already fallen. Hay is not fuel, it is grass. It burns the way grass burns, fast and bright and gone, throwing a little heat for a few minutes and then collapsing into ash that gives nothing back. To heat a house with hay, you cannot simply feed it into a stove, because loose hay flares and dies before it can warm anything. So the families learned to twist it. You took an armful of hay and you wound it and folded it on itself, hard, working it into a tight, dense stick that would hold together and burn slow. A stick that did the job a single lump of coal would have done for a fraction of the time, and then you did it again and again and again, all day, every day, for as long as the winter lasted. This is the labour the book mentions and moves past, and it is the labour the record will not let you move past because it is the texture of how they actually lived. Someone in that house was twisting hay during most of the waking hours of most of the days of that winter. The supply burned so fast that the making of it never stopped. Hands that were already cold worked dry, sharp grass into sticks until the skin split, and then kept working. Because the alternative to the next haystick was a colder room. There was no version of resting. The fire was only ever a few minutes from going out, and going out, in that cold, in that house, was not an inconvenience. It was the thing they were all, every hour, working to prevent. Picture the room itself, because this is where the women's whole winter was spent. A board building in a board town, the wind finding every seam, frost on the inside of the walls, water freezing in the bucket if it sat too far from the stove. A single small fire of twisted hay, throwing a pool of heat that reached only so far so that the family lived crowded into that one warm circle, and the corners of the room belonged to the cold. The light was poor because the kerosene had to be saved, so the long dark evenings were spent mostly in shadow, listening to the wind. And blind Mary sat in the middle of all of it, in a dark that had no fire to flicker in it at all, taking the whole winter on faith, on sound, on the nearness of the others. And there were 9 of them in that space by the worst of it, not 6. The Ingalls had taken in the Masters family, George and Maggie and their infant son, and the little rooms that had been tight for 6 were unbearable for 9. 9 bodies breathing the same air, 9 mouths to feed off rations that had been calculated for fewer. 9 sets of nerves fraying against each other in the cold and the dark, day after day, with no way to step outside and no end in sight. Think about what that does to a household. The small irritations that, in a normal life, you walk off in the next room. The griefs you swallow because there is no privacy to feel them in. The fear that travels from one face to the next in a single glance. The sound of a baby crying in the night, and the cold you would have to walk into to soothe it, and the calculation, never spoken but always running, of whether the warmth you would lose by getting up is worth the comfort you would give. That was the room. For 7 months. And the person who kept that room from becoming a place where people turned on each other, who kept the irritations from becoming fractures, and the fear from becoming panic, and the rationing from becoming resentment, was, again, the woman who never stopped moving through it, and moving through that room, hour after hour, keeping the fire fed and the children calm and the small portions of food coming, was Carolyn. The men of this story go out into the storm. We will get to them, and what they did was genuinely brave. But bravery that happens in an afternoon is easy to make a legend of. The harder thing, the thing that has almost no story attached to it because it photographs as nothing, is what Caroline did, which was to not stop, to get up in the cold dark and keep a house full of people alive through one more day, and then do it again, with no end in sight and no certainty that the food would outlast the winter. And to do it without letting the fear that any sane person would have felt show on her face where the children could see it. That is its own kind of courage, the kind that gets called, dismissively, just keeping house, and the kind that is in fact the entire reason anyone in that building saw the spring. Because the fire was the first crisis, but it was not the worst one. The worst one was quieter. And it came on slowly, and it was measured not in cold but in the shrinking of the portions on the table. The coal was gone and they had answered the cold with hay. But the flour was going too, and there is no twisting trick that makes grass into bread. When the last of the flour was gone, what the town had left was seed wheat. And seed wheat is not food. Not in any form a person can eat. It is hard little kernels meant to go into the ground in spring and become a crop. To get bread out of it, you first have to turn it into flour. And the town had no working mill, and no power to run one if it had. So the families went back, the the way they had gone back to grass for fuel, to the oldest tool in the house. They ground the wheat in coffee mills, by hand. A coffee mill is a small wooden box with a crank and a little iron burr inside, made to grind a handful of beans for a morning pot. It was never meant to feed anyone, but you could pour wheat into the top and turn the crank and turn it, and a thin trickle of coarse brown meal would come out the bottom, enough after a long while for a little bread. And so that became the other endless labour of that house, beside the hay. Someone was always at the mill. The arm aches first, then the shoulder, then the whole side of you, and you switch hands and keep going. Because the bread for the day is in the box, and it comes out only as fast as you turn. Think about the two labours together. Because together they are the winter. On one side of the room, hands twisting hay so the fire does not die. On the other, hands grinding wheat so the family does not starve. Both of them constant. Both of them producing just barely enough. Just barely in time. With no surplus ever. No morning where you woke up and the work was done. The long winter, stripped of the storybook, is mostly this. Two repetitive, exhausting, never-finished labours performed in a cold half-dark by people who were slowly getting hungrier, month after month. And the bread itself was not the warm, fragrant thing the word calls to mind. It was coarse and dark and heavy, made of nothing but the ground wheat, because the other things that make bread, the fat, the sugar, the leavening, the variety, were gone. It filled the stomach, it kept them alive, and it was, day after day after day, almost the only thing there was. The grinding misery of monotony like that is its own kind of pain, in eating the same poor thing at every meal with no end you can see. It is hard to convey from a warm room a century and a half later. It is not the drama of starvation. It is the long, dull weight of barely enough, stretching on past the point where hope of variety, of plenty, of simple fullness, quietly gives out. The family did not starve. That is the headline, and it is real. And it was not guaranteed. They came through with everyone breathing, which in that winter, in that country, was a victory. But the line between the family that survives and the family that does not is thinner than the books let you feel. And it ran, that winter, straight through the smallest and weakest person in the house. The one the long winter came closest to killing was not Pa, was not Laura, was not the brave young man on the sled. It was a 10-year-old girl whose body had never had anything to spare, and the winter reached into her and took a piece of her health that it kept for the next 65 years. Her name was Carrie, and this is the part of the story the book could not hold. Every family that goes hungry together does not go hungry equally. The cold and the want press hardest on whoever has the least to spare. And in the Ingalls house, that was not in question. It was Carrie. She was 10 years old that winter, and she had been frail her whole short life, small for her age, thin in a way that had always worried the family, prone to whatever sickness came through. A strong child can lose weight through a hungry winter and have weight to lose. Carrie had none. So as the portion shrank and the cold went on and the bread stayed coarse and thin, the winter began, slowly, to take her in a way it was not taking the others. Laura saw it, and even Laura, who was not in the business of dwelling on her little sister, let it onto the page. There is a moment in her account where the family's at the work of survival, grinding, twisting, enduring, and Carrie is simply failing to keep up. Too pale, too thin, getting thinner. Wilder writes it gently, the way you write a thing you do not want to look at directly, but the fact under the gentle writing is as stark as anything in the whole story. Of all of them, the one the long winter came closest to killing was Carrie, and here the women's whole winter comes into its sharpest focus, because saving the weakest child is not a heroic act you perform once. It is 1,000 small decisions made in silence over months. It is the mother who finds a way for the frail one to have a little more and the strong ones a little less, and arranges it so the children barely notice it is happening. It is the constant watching, the noticing of who is fading and how fast, the rationing of not just food but warmth, the best place by the fire going without anyone saying so, to the one who needs it most. None of that is in any legend. All of it is the reason a 10-year-old who should not have lasted the winter. She lasted it. But she did not come out of it whole. The frailty that had always been a vague trait of Carrie's hardened that winter into a lasting condition. For the rest of her long life, her lungs and her breathing would trouble her. She would chase easier air across half a continent, from the Dakota Prairie to Colorado to Wyoming to the Black Hills of South Dakota, never quite outrunning the chest that one starving winter had given her. She settled eventually in a little mining town called Keystone, where she married a widower named David Swansea and lived out her years. She survived the long winter, and she paid for surviving it every year afterward for 65 more years. She died on the 2nd of June, 1946, at the age of 75. The winter that had marked her was, by then, 65 years gone. Her lungs remembered it anyway, which is exactly what the winter was doing on the inside, in the house, to the smallest of them, all through the months. Meanwhile, outside, the thing that would become the legend was getting ready to happen, because the wheat in the coffee mills was running out too, and somewhere out on the frozen prairie, in a claim shanty the storms had buried, there was said to be more. 2 young men were about to ride out into the white to find it. The town would remember their names for it. The town would forget the names of the women who turned what they brought back into bread. And that imbalance, that quiet theft of credit, is the thing this whole story has been building toward. This is the part everyone remembers, and it deserves to be remembered. So let us tell it true, and then tell you what telling it true reveals. By late winter, the town itself, not just the Ingalls house but the whole settlement, was running out of the seed wheat that had become its last food. And a rumour went around that a homesteader somewhere south of town, off across the open country, had wheat. A man who had grown a crop and held it back. The trouble was the country between. To reach him, you had to cross miles of unmarked, snowed-over prairie in the dead of that winter, in the narrow, uncertain gap between one blizzard and the next, with no road, no shelter, and no second chance if a storm caught you in the open. To go was to gamble your life. To not go was to watch the town slide towards starvation. 2 young men went. One was Ingalls Wilder, in his early 20s that winter, a farmer from New York State who had filed a claim outside to Smet, and who years later would marry Laura. The other was his friend Cap Garland, 16 years old, a farm boy from a neighbouring claim, an avid baseball player, the kind of young man other young men liked. They took a sled out across the white. They found the homesteader. They talked him out of his wheat. They loaded some 60 bushels of it, and they made the run back, beating the next storm by a margin that does not bear thinking about too closely. They brought the wheat into town. It fed the settlement through the worst of what was left, and it is, by any honest measure, a genuinely brave thing that genuinely helps save lives. Let the details stand for a moment, because they are the kind of thing that makes the danger real. The homesteader was somewhere to the south, some 40 miles of open, trackless, snowed-under prairie away, there and back, a distance that means nothing on a summer road, and everything in the dead of that winter, when there was no road, no fence line, no landmark left unburied to steer by, and when a blizzard could rise out of a clear sky in minutes and erase the world. The 2 of them crossed it on a sled, found the man, talked him out of the wheat he had been holding back, loaded 60 bushels of it, and turned for home, racing a sky that could have killed them both in the open with no one ever the wiser until spring. They made it. The wheat they carried in went into the same coffee mills, to be ground by the same aching arms, into the same coarse bread. That had been keeping the town alive all along. The ride did not end the winter. It bought the town more days of the grinding labour that was the only thing standing between the settlement and starvation. It is also, almost in its entirety, the story the winter is remembered by. The young men, the sled, the dash across the storm. It is the part with motion in it, with a clear danger and a clear deed and a clear hero riding back through the snow. It became Almanzo's legend, and it followed him the rest of his long life. He lived to be 90. dying in 1949, and Cap Garland got a share of it too. A young man briefly made famous for one wild ride who would not live to grow old. Cap Garland died on the 3rd of November 1891. He was 26. He was working with a threshing crew in Badger Township when the boiler on the machine exploded, threw him over the separator and into a nearby field. He lived for only several hours. He was buried in Willow Lake Cemetery in Clark County. The boy who had ridden out into the storm for the wheat was killed 10 years after the ride by his own farm equipment. Now hold that beside everything we have already watched and feel the imbalance of it. The wheat run took a day. The winter took 7 months. The young men crossed the danger once, in the open, in daylight, and rode home to be remembered. The women crossed their danger every single day, in the dark, in the house, and were remembered by almost no one. Caroline ground the wheat those men risked their lives to bring. Caroline twisted the hay. Caroline stretched the portions. Caroline kept the blind daughter and the failing daughter and the baby alive for month after month after month. And there is no legend with her name on it. The town survived because 2 boys made a brave run. The town also survived far more because in every house there was a woman who simply did not stop. And that second kind of survival has never been a story, because it has no single afternoon you can point to. It is just a winter's worth of women not laying down a burden that would have killed the family if they had. The wheat came, the worst of the starving eased, but the winter was not finished, and the longest, darkest, most hopeless stretch of it, the part where even the strong began to wonder if spring was ever actually coming, was still to be lived through, and it had to be lived through the same way everything else had been. One haystack, one turn of the mill, one small divided meal, one more day at a time. There is a detail in Laura's account so small that it is easy to read past, and it is, in its small way, the most frightening thing in the whole book. Pa stopped playing the fiddle. All through the 8 books, the fiddle is the sound of the family being all right. Whenever things are hard, Pa takes it down and plays, and the music says without anyone having to say it that the centre is holding. The fiddle is morale. It is the family's proof to itself that it is still a family and not just a group of frightened people in a cold room. And in the depths of that winter the music stopped, because the cold had cracked and stiffened Pa's hands until his fingers could no longer find the strings. When the fiddle goes quiet, you're not reading about weather anymore. You're reading about the slow failure of the thing that holds people together, because what the long middle of that winter attacked was not only the body, it was the spirit. 7 months is a very long time to be cold and hungry and afraid with no certain end. The blizzards came and came until they stopped being events and became simply the condition of the world, the way things were and seemingly always would be. The dark came early and stayed late. The food was the same poor bread. The work was the same endless twisting and grinding. And underneath it all ran the question that no one in that house would say out loud in front of the children. The question that the silence fiddle asks for them. What if it does not end? What if the spring does not come in time? This is the part of the winter that has no action in it, and so it has no legend. And so it is the part most worth slowing down on. Because it is where families actually break, not in the dramatic crisis, which calls up a kind of strength, but in the long middle, when the crisis will not resolve and will not relent and just goes on, and the strength that the first emergency summoned has nowhere left to draw from. That was the stretch the Ingallses had to cross in February and March. Not a battle, a slow wearing down of the soul, fought by staying ordinary, by getting up, by twisting the hay and turning the mill and dividing the bread one more time when every reason to do so had worn thin. And the one who held the ordinary together again was Caroline. A man whose hands have failed at the fiddle is a man at the edge of his own usefulness, and Charles, by every honest reading, was nearer the edge that winter than the books admit. The steadiness the family needed, in the months when steadiness was the only thing keeping them human, came mostly from the mother. She kept the routine. She kept the calm. She kept, as far as the children could see, the faith that this would end, whether or not she felt it herself. Holding a family's morale together through a hopeless stretch, while privately doing the math that says it might not be survivable, is perhaps the hardest thing a person can be asked to do. And it is asked over and over of the women in these stories, and it is almost never what they get remembered for. The fiddle was quiet, but the house went on, and the question of whether spring would come in time was, by then, not a feeling, but a measurable thing, a race between the dwindling supplies and the turning of the season, and the records that survive let us see now exactly how close that race actually was. For a long time, the long winter was a story, and stories are easy to suspect of exaggeration. A woman writing for children 60 years after the fact, remembering the worst winter of her life. Surely people thought she made it larger than it was. Surely memory and the needs of a good book had stretched it. They had not. If anything, they had shrunk it. The plain historical name for the event is the hard winter of 1880 to 1881, and it is not remembered only because of one book. It is in the weather records of the whole northern plains, in the railroad logs, in the newspapers of a dozen towns that had nothing to do with the Ingalls family. It began on the record with that blizzard on the 15th of October far too early, and it ran in an almost unbroken chain of storms into April. In 2020, a study published in the Bulletin of the American Meteorological Society went back and reconstructed that winter from the surviving data. The lead author was a meteorologist and climate scientist named Barbara Mays Boosted at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. And what she and her co-authors found lined up, again and again, with what the girl from Smet had written from memory. The number of blizzards, the relentlessness of them, the depth and the duration of the cold. She had gotten it right, not approximately, closely, because a winter like that does not blur in the memory of someone who barely lived through it. The specifics the record preserves are their own kind of testimony. The chain of storms was nearly unbroken from that 15th of October start straight through to spring. Blizzard after blizzard with rarely more than a few days of brutal clear cold between them. So many that the people living through them lost the ability to count them as separate events. The cold ran deep and stayed. The kind of cold that is not a temperature so much as a presence, that gets into the walls and the bedding and the bones and does not leave. And the snow did the one thing that mattered most. It did not melt. In an ordinary hard winter, storms come and the snow between them settles and shrinks. That winter, each storm's snow simply joined the last, packing deeper and harder, burying the railroad cuts under drifts that set up like stone, until the simple act of moving a train from one town to the next became a battle that the most determined crews in the country could not win. There is a photograph from the period taken in southern Minnesota on the 29th of March, 1881. It shows snowdrifts higher than the locomotive standing beside them. The trains look small, the snow looks geological. That is what the record looks like when you can see it, and the record adds the things a children's book could never hold. It was not only Smet, the whole region was buried. Towns up and down the line were cut off the same way, living the same blockade, grinding the same wheat, burning whatever they had. The railroads across vast stretches of the territory simply surrendered the fight against the snow. And then, when it finally broke, the winter killed in a way the book has no room for at all. All that snow, all those months of it, melted in a rush when the thaw came, and the meltwater had nowhere to go. The rivers jammed with ice and overran their banks. Whole riverside towns were flooded and washed out. By several accounts, more lives were lost in the floods that followed the hard winter than in the long blockade of the winter itself. We will come back to the floods. For now, hold this. The death toll for the entire season was never fully counted, because out on the isolated claims, scattered across that enormous country, people died alone in the cold and were found in the spring, or were simply never accounted for at all. The Ingalls family was a single household inside that country, not a cosy hardship with a fiddle and a happy ending. One of the deadliest winters the Northern Plains have on record, a regional catastrophe that the storybook narrowed down, for the sake of children, into the survivable adventure of one family. The adventure is true, the catastrophe around it is also true, and bigger. And the family survival looks different, and frankly more remarkable once you can see the scale of the thing they came through. They came through it, but they came through it changed, every one of them. And the change is the part of the story that begins only after the snow is gone. First, though, there was someone in that house for whom the entire 7 months had a different shape, because she never saw a single flake of the snow that was trying to kill them all. Her name was Mary, and she was already in the dark. Mary Ingalls spent the long winter blind. She had lost her sight only a little over a year before, at 14. The family called it a fever and a stroke, and for more than a century the story went that it was scarlet fever that took her vision. It almost certainly was not. In 2013, a study in the journal Pediatrics, led by a pediatrician named Beth Tarini at the University of Michigan, went back through Mary's case using medical papers from the 19th century, unpublished family journals, and old newspaper clippings, and the conclusion was that the illness that destroyed Mary's vision was most likely viral meningoencephalitis, a virus, an inflammation of the brain and the membranes around it, something that, in 1879, on the edge of settled country, no doctor could have stopped even if they had known what it was. By the winter of 1880, the loss was total and permanent. So while the rest of the family fought a war they could at least see, the storms at the window, the failing fire, the shrinking food, Mary fought it in a darkness that had no fire to flicker in it and no window to watch. She took the whole winter on sound and cold and faith. Try for a moment to be inside it. You cannot see the blizzard, but you can hear it, the wall of wind that does not stop for days. And you have learned by now what that sound means for the food and the fuel. You cannot see the fire, so you cannot know by looking whether it is dying. You know it only by the cold creeping back toward you and by the sounds of someone getting up, again, to twist more hay. You cannot see the faces of the people you love, so you cannot read in them whether today is a frightened day. And you become, of necessity, an instrument for hearing fear instead, in the pitch of a voice, in a silence held a beat too long. You're the most dependent person in a house where dependence has become dangerous, where every mouth is a calculation, and you know it. And there is nothing you can do to make yourself less of a weight, except to be calm and to take up as little as you can and to trust. There is a courage in that, and it is not the courage anyone tells stories about. Mary's whole role in the family had always been to be the good one, the capable one, and blindness had taken from her overnight the ability to be capable in any of the ways the frontier counted. Through that winter she could not grind, could not twist hay, could not fetch or watch or do. She could only endure and not add to anyone's fear, and hold her dignity in a dark that gave her nothing to hold it with. She did. By every account she came through the long winter the way she came through everything after it, quietly, without complaint, refusing to be only the family's tragedy. And the family, even at the edge of starving, kept arranging itself around her, the way it always had and always would. The blind sister was protected through the winter the same way the sickly sister was, by a mother and by sisters who simply absorbed the extra labour of her care into the unending labour of everything else, and never seemed to have counted it as a sacrifice, because it was not a decision. It was just what you did. You kept the weakest ones alive. You did not ask what it cost you until later, if ever. They all lived. Blind Mary, frail Carrie, baby Grace, Laura, Caroline, Charles, every one of them came out the far side still breathing. And the far side, when it finally arrived, did not arrive in December where the calendar promised it. It arrived in May, in a thaw that came almost too late, and it brought with it a small, strange, deferred mercy that the family had been saving up for half a year. A Christmas barrel, stranded somewhere down the frozen line since December, finally about to arrive. Spring on the northern plains does not announce itself. It just one day stops being winter. The storms that had come for 7 months ran out of force. The cold loosened, and at last, somewhere past the middle of it all, the snow in the great cuts began to soften, enough that men could move it. And the railroad, which had given the town up for dead in January, came back to life. A train got through. The first one in months. It is hard to imagine from a heated room what the sound of that train meant to the people who heard it. It was not just supplies, though, it was that. The coal and the kerosene and the flour and the simple fact of food that was not ground wheat. It was the end of the blockade. It was proof that the world still existed beyond the wall of snow, that they had not been forgotten, that the winter that had felt like it would never end had, in fact, ended. And they had outlasted it. People wept at the sight of a freight train. You would have too. And then the family did a thing that is somehow the most moving small detail in the whole story. The Christmas barrel, the box of treats and small gifts that had been meant to reach them back in December and had sat stranded somewhere down the frozen line for months finally arrived. And the Ingallses in May, with the prairie greening outside and the worst winter of their lives finally behind them, sat down and had their Christmas. Months late. And there is something in that act that is worth slowing down on. Because the easy thing, after a winter like that, would have been to let Christmas go. To say, it is too late, the moment has passed, we will pick it up again next December. To fold the loss into the long ledger of things the winter had taken, alongside the coal and the kerosene and the flour and Carrie's lungs and Pa's hands and whatever it had taken out of all of them that they could not yet name. They did not do that. They sat down, in May, in a house that still bore the marks of the blockade, and they had Christmas. They opened a barrel that had been meant for December. They put on the small new things that had come in it. They ate a turkey, the first real meal in months, and they let the celebration be what it was, late and smaller than it would have been, and theirs. That is not a small thing. That is a choice to refuse the winter the last word, a choice to insist that the stolen holiday would be reclaimed, even out of season, even with thinner hands and quieter voices and the knowledge that nothing, including them, was quite the same as before. It is the same stubbornness that had kept them twisting hay when the fire was barely worth the effort. The same refusal to lay the burden down, applied this time to joy. And that maybe is the thing the book got most right, even in its softness. The family that walked out of the long winter was not the family that walked in, but they walked out, and they sat down to a delayed Christmas, and they chose, in the face of everything, to celebrate. The book remembers what was in the barrel, and it is worth remembering. Carolyn, received a new dress and a silk shawl. Mary, the blind sister, received new warm underclothes and a fascinator, a kind of head shawl. Laura received a new pair of shoes, 5 pairs of machine-knit woolen stockings, and a complete set of embroidery silks, which, the book notes, caught on the roughness of her fingers, scarred from twisting hay. Read that again. Her fingers were so torn up from the winter's work that the embroidery thread snagged on them. That detail is the one Laura kept, the body remembering what the mind had softened. Carrie received a coat, a hood, and mittens. Pa received 2 white shirts and a cap. And for Grace, the baby, 2 dresses to grow into, and a couple of baby books. There was a turkey. There were the small pleasures that had been impossible all winter, the simple miracle of enough. They held Christmas in May because the winter had stolen it in December, and there is something in that act, in the refusal to let the season simply be a loss, in the insistence on having the celebration even months out of its time, that tells you everything about how this family survived. They did not survive by being heroes. They survived by being stubborn about the ordinary, by twisting one more haystick, by grinding one more cup of wheat, by keeping the weak ones warm and the children calm and the routine intact all the way through, and then, when it was over, by sitting down to a delayed Christmas and choosing joy anyway, late, because late was what was on offer. That is where the book ends. The thaw, the train, the Christmas in May, the warmth restored, the family whole. And as an ending it is true, and it is earned, and the family did deserve their turkey in the spring. but it is also, like everything in the book, the soft version, because it ends on the morning of the rest of their lives, and it does not follow them into the years where the bill for that winter came due. The winter was over. What the winter had done was not, and before we follow that bill into the years after, it is worth stopping the calendar entirely and living one single day of that winter the way they lived it, because the months were only this day repeated until the season let go. To understand the winter, stop counting months and live a single day of it, because the months were only this day, repeated until the season let go. It starts before light. The fire has burned low in the night, and the cold has come back into the room to take what the dark hours always tried to take. Someone wakes first, and the first thought of the day is the same as the last thought of the night, which is the fire. The water in the bucket has a skin of ice on it if it sat too far from the stove. The frost has crept across the inside of the boards. You get up into air that bites, and you feed the stove the twisted hay you made the evening before, and you coax the little flame back, and the small circle of warmth opens up again in the middle of the cold room. And the day can begin. Then the labour, which is the day, which is the winter. The hay must be twisted, because what burns in an hour must be replaced in an hour. So the making of fuel never stops and never gets ahead. The wheat must be ground, cup by cup, turn by turn, the arm aching and then the shoulder, switching hands and grinding on, because the bread for the day comes out of the mill only as fast as someone turns it. And no one is going to turn it but you. The bread is made and divided, and the portions are smaller than a body wants, and you eat the coarse, dark stuff that is almost the only thing there is, and you are not full when you finish, and you will not be full at the next meal either, and you have stopped by now expecting to be. And around all of that, the watching. The mother's eyes moving over the children, reading them. Is Carrie paler today? Is the baby warm enough? Is Mary, who cannot say with her face whether the fear has reached her, sitting too still? The cold and the hunger press hardest on the weakest, and so the weakest must be watched hardest. And a portion evened out without a word, a place by the fire given without a word, a small extra warmth arranged so naturally that the child who receives it does not know she's being saved. The light fails early, because the days are at their shortest, and because the kerosene must be hoarded. So the long evening comes on in shadow. The wind most nights is still there. The wall of sound that has been the ceiling of the world for so long now that its absence on the rare still night is what feels strange. And the family draws into the one warm circle, and once there would have been the fiddle, and now there is not, because Pa's hands have failed at it. So there is talk, or there is silence, or there is the small effort of keeping the children's spirits up with a story or a memory of a summer that feels, in that room, like something that happened to other people. There were small mercies inside the day, and they mattered more than small mercies usually do because there was so little else. A story told well enough to make a frightened child forget, for a few minutes, that she was hungry. A scrap of warmth when two people sat close. The brief animal comfort of the bread while it lasted in the mouth. The women of that house spent part of their failing strength on these, on keeping the children's spirits up, on making the unbearable day feel, to the youngest at least, like an ordinary one, and that effort was not a frill. Morale is a survival resource like any other. A family that despairs stops twisting the hay as carefully, stops dividing the food as fairly, stops doing the 100 small exact things that keep everyone alive. Holding the mood of the room steady was as much a part of surviving as grinding the wheat, and it was, like everything else, mostly the work of the mother and the older girls, performed on empty stomachs, in a cold half-dark, with no audience and no reward except the continued unremarkable fact of everyone waking up again the next morning. And then you bank the fire as well as hay will let you, and you sleep in the cold, and you wake before light, and the fire has burned low again, and the day starts over, exactly the same, with no way to know how many more of these days are still to come. That was the winter. Not 7 months of drama. 7 months of that one day, lived again and again by people who were slowly getting hungrier and colder and more tired, and who did not stop. Because stopping was the one thing that would have killed them all. And it was not just the Ingalls house. Every family in that little board town was running the same impossible arithmetic, the same vanished coal, the same hay twisted into fuel, the same wheat ground by hand, the same watching of the weakest member fade. The Ingalls were not having a private adventure. They were one household in a community that was all together, slowly starving and freezing in the dark. The Ingalls family did not endure that winter alone, and the rest of the town is worth bringing into the firelight, because the scale of the thing is part of its truth. Smet in that winter was a small huddle of board buildings on an enormous frozen prairie, and every family in it was running the same impossible arithmetic the Ingalls were, the same vanished coal, the same hay twisted into fuel, the same wheat ground by hand in coffee mills when the flour gave out. The store, which in a normal winter would have restocked again and again off the trains, simply ran down, its shelves emptying with no way to refill them, until what the town had was all the town had. There was no authority coming to help. The county was thinly settled and snowed under itself. The territory was vast and frozen. The nearest real help was on the far side of the same impassable snow that had trapped them. It might as well have been on the moon. This is the part the single-family story cannot show you. The Ingalls were not having a private adventure. They were one household in a community that was, altogether, slowly starving and freezing in the dark. Each family behind its own thin walls, doing its own grinding and twisting, watching its own weakest members fade, with no certainty for any of them about how the sun would come out. When the rumour of wheat sent 2 young men across the prairie, it was not to save one family. It was because the whole town had run its food down to the edge at the same time. The wheat run is remembered as Almanzo's story. But it was the town's hunger that sent him, and the town's survival that rode back on that sled. And beyond Smet, the same blockade was being lived in town after town across the northern plains, and out on the scattered claims in the worst of it, alone. A family in a snowed-under claim shanty miles from any neighbour had no town to huddle into, no store to draw the last of its goods from, no 2 brave boys likely to reach them. Some of those families did not survive, and were found in the spring, and were counted, when they were counted at all, in numbers no one ever fully assembled. The Ingalls, for all their hardship, were in town, close to others, near the thin thread of community that gave a family its best odds. That they came so close to losing Carrie even so tells you what the odds were for the families who faced that winter without even that. Try to picture what an isolated claim family faced that winter, because the scale of the loneliness is part of the danger. A claim shanty was not a house. It was a thin wooden structure, often no bigger than a modern garden shed, built by a family who had come west with almost nothing and filed on 160 acres of open prairie. The nearest neighbour might be miles away. The nearest town, a half-day's ride in good weather. In a blizzard, both were another planet. A family in a claim shanty had no store to fall back on when the flour ran out. No neighbour with wheat to spare. No 2 young men likely to ride across the snow for them, because no one would know they were dying until the thaw. If the fire went out, they froze. If the food ran out, they starved. If a child got sick, there was no doctor and no way to reach one. If the roof failed under the weight of the snow, there was no one to help repair it. If the father went out for fuel and did not come back, the mother and children waited, in the cold, in the dark, with no way to know if he was alive. Some of those families were found in the spring, huddled together where they had died. Some were found alone, having walked out into the storm for reasons no one would ever know. Some were never found at all. The prairie is large, and the snow hides what it takes. The death toll was never fully counted, because no one was counting. The territory was vast. The records were thin. The people who died on the claims were often people no one in any town had ever known were there. The Ingalls family lived inside that country, one lit window in a dark full of other windows, some of which went out and were never relit. So when the books make the long winter feel intimate and almost cozy, a family pulling together by lamplight, hold the wider frame in your mind. The intimacy is real. It is also one small lit window in an enormous dark country full of other windows, some of which went out that winter and did not light again. The Ingalls family's survival is moving not because they were special, but because they were ordinary. One ordinary household that happened to make it, in a season that did not let everyone make it. And the reason that household made it, the reason it did not go dark the way some of those other windows did, sits in the corner of every scene we have been in, doing the work, holding the ordinary together, never breaking. It is fair to ask, watching one woman hold a family together through 7 months that broke stronger things, where that came from. People do not arrive at that kind of endurance by accident. Caroline Ingalls did not. She had been trained for it, the hard way, from the very beginning of her life. It is fair to ask, watching one woman hold a family together through 7 months that broke stronger things, where that came from. People do not arrive at that kind of endurance by accident. Caroline Ingalls did not. She had been trained for it, the hard way, from the beginning of her life. Before she was Ma, she was Caroline Quiner, and the defining fact of her childhood was loss. Her father was Henry Newcomb Quiner. He served as second mate on a schooner called the Ocean, and in November of 1845, when Caroline was 5 years old, the Ocean capsized in Lake Michigan, off St. Joseph, Michigan. There were no survivors. Her widowed mother was left to hold a houseful of children together on the edge of settled country, in an age with no insurance, no pension, no safety net of any kind except relatives and grit. Caroline grew up in a household that came so close to the edge that the children learned to treat hunger as a normal house guest, and she learned in her body the lesson that would define her, that you do not fall apart, because there is no one to fall apart in front of, because the falling apart is a luxury that a family on the edge cannot afford. She came out of that childhood not broken but hardened into a particular shape. She got an education, which for a poor frontier girl was its own act of will. She became a school teacher, and she carried, for the rest of her life, a quiet, fierce attachment to respectability, to a clean house and decent manners and the appearance of order, an attachment that can look like fussiness until you understand where it came from. It came from poverty. A family that has been truly poor, truly near the edge, often holds hardest to the outward forms of dignity, because those forms are the one thing the poverty cannot take if you refuse to let it. Caroline had watched her widowed mother hold a family together on nothing but spine and propriety, and she had learned that the keeping up of appearances was not vanity but armour. The daily insistence that the family was not beaten, no matter how close to beaten it actually was. You keep the house, you keep the appearance of order, you keep your fear to yourself, because the children are watching, and what the children see is what they will believe about whether the world is survivable. She carried that into her marriage to a charming, restless man who would spend their life together chasing a horizon that kept costing them everything. And she met each cost the same way, by absorbing it without spectacle. By the winter of 1880, she had already survived more than most people survive in a lifetime. Grasshopper plagues that ate whole crops, a baby son buried on the road, failed claim after failed claim, the going blind of her eldest daughter. The long winter was the hardest single thing the family ever faced, but it was not, for Caroline, a new kind of thing. It was the same demand she had been answering her whole life, only longer and colder, and with the stakes raised to the top. Keep the children alive. Do not let them see you afraid. Hold the ordinary together until the danger passes. That is why she did not break. Not because she was made of something other people are not, but because she had been tempered, early and without mercy, into exactly the instrument that winter required, and had been using that instrument so long that using it through months of blockade was terribly just more of what she already knew how to do. There is no medal for that. There is barely a mention. The discipline that saves a family looks, from the outside, like a woman simply doing the housework. And so it disappears into the word, and the word disappears into the background of a story about a brave father and a famous winter. But it is the centre of the thing. Strip the long winter down to the one fact that mattered most, and the fact is not the cold, or the wheat run, or the trains. It is that there was, in that house, a woman who had been taught by her own hard life never to lay the burden down, and who did not lay it down for 7 months, and who therefore was the reason the others lived to remember it at all. That is who she was. Now it is worth understanding, in cold medical terms, what she was actually up against. Because the winter the Ingallses survived was a slow, 7-month contest between two forces in the human beings in that house, and it is worth knowing in the body what those forces do. We say cold and hunger the way we say rain and wind, as if they are only weather to be waited out. They are not. They are forces that work on a living body in specific, measurable ways, and the winter the Ingallses survived was a slow, 7-month contest between those forces and the human beings in that house. It is worth understanding what they were actually up against, because it makes plain how close the contest ran. Start with the cold, because the cold sets the trap that the hunger springs. A body keeps itself alive by holding a narrow band of warmth at its core, and in deep cold it has to burn fuel constantly just to hold that band. The colder it gets, and the longer it lasts, the more fuel the body spends simply existing. In an ordinary winter with food on the table, that is a cost you pay and replace. But the long winter took the food away at exactly the moment it was demanding the most of it. The bodies in that house needed more fuel than usual to fight the cold, and were being given less than usual to do it with, for month after month. That is the cruel mathematics underneath the whole story. Cold raises the price of staying alive. Hunger empties the purse, and the two of them together come for the weakest first, and what they take they often do not give back. Prolonged cold cracks and splits the skin, as it did to Charles's hands until the fiddle fell silent. And it kills tissue at the edges of the body, the fingers, the toes, the face, where the blood is sacrificed to keep the core warm. Prolonged hunger does its damage deeper and quieter. It wears down the body's defences until illness, which a fed and rested body would shrug off, becomes a real threat. A child going through that, a body still trying to grow on too little food in too much cold, can take damage that does not heal when the spring comes. Damage that becomes simply a part of how that body works for the rest of its life, which is exactly what happened to the smallest of them. Carrie went into that winter frail, and came out of it marked, her lungs and her breathing compromised in a way that never fully resolved across the 65 years she had left. She would spend her adult life chasing easier air, Colorado, Wyoming, the Black Hills, never quite outrunning the chest that one starving winter had given her. The winter did not kill her. It did something slower and almost as cruel. It reached into a 10-year-old body that had nothing to spare, and took a piece of her health that she would never get back, and then it let her live for decades inside the consequences. That is the part the survival story leaves out. We say they survived, and they did, and survival sounds like a clean line, alive on one side, dead on the other. But the truth of a winter like that is written in the wide grey territory between those two words, in the bodies that lived but did not live unharmed, in the costs that were not paid all at once in the winter, but in instalments, across all the years that came after. The Ingallses won their contest with the cold and the hunger. They just did not win it for free. Nobody does. And the bill did not come due only for Carrie. It came for Charles. It came for Mary. It came in the quietest way for Caroline herself. And it came for the family as a whole, which walked out of that winter different from the family that walked in. The winter was 7 months. The paying for it went on for decades. The book ends with the Christmas in May, with the warmth restored and the family whole. And if you close it there, you can believe they simply walked back into their lives unchanged. They did not. A winter like that does not let go of the people it spares. It follows them. It followed Carrie longest and most plainly. The lungs the winter marked stayed marked. She would spend her adult life chasing easier air across half the country, from the Dakota Prairie to Colorado to Wyoming to the Black Hills, never quite outrunning the chest that one starving winter had given her. Of all the people in that house, she was the one who carried the long winter in her body to the end of her days, the quiet, lifelong receipt for a survival that the story remembers as a happy ending. It followed Charles too in a way the family felt more than they could prove. Laura noticed and said in her quiet way that after the long winter, Pa was never quite the same. Something in the restless, fiddle-playing vitality that had defined him seemed to have been spent in that winter and not fully recovered. He lived another 20-some years. But the man who came out of that winter was, by the family's own sense of it, a little more worn, a little nearer his limits, than the man who had gone in. When he died in 1902 of a failing heart, it was a long way from that winter. And yet some part of the family always seemed to date the slow turning of his health to the season that had cracked his hands and silenced his music. The record cannot prove the line. The family seems to have felt it anyway. There is a detail that some who have studied the family point to, and it is worth offering carefully because it is suggestive rather than certain. Charles was, by various accounts, a lifelong user of tobacco, and the heart trouble that eventually killed him is the kind of thing that decades of that layered onto a body worn by a hard frontier life and one catastrophic winter would help explain. People in his own time spoke of such deaths in their own plain language. The exact medical chain across a century is beyond proving now. What is not in doubt is the family's own quiet conviction, passed down through Laura, that the restless music-making father, who went into the long winter at the height of his powers, came out of it diminished and never fully climbed back, and that the slow road to the bed he died in 20-some years later began somewhere in that cold. It followed Mary into the dark she already lived in. One more ordeal survived, without sight, one more proof that she would endure whatever was asked of her, and ask for nothing in return. And it followed Caroline the way every hardship followed Carolyn. It was absorbed, folded away, added to the long private ledger of things she carried and did not discuss. She had held the family through the worst winter of their lives, and her reward was the same as it always was. No medal, no legend, no chapter with her name on it. Just the next demand, and the next, and the lifelong understanding that the holding together was simply her job, and not a thing anyone was going to thank her for. And it was not only the Ingallses. Every family in that town carried something out of the winter that the spring did not wash off. There were families who had lost someone out on the claims, found in the thaw, buried late. There were children who had watched a parent break in the long middle and never quite come back. There were marriages that had bent under months of blockade and never fully straightened. There were old people who had gone into the winter strong and come out of it diminished, and who would not see another Dakota spring. The town itself carried it, the way towns do when they have been through something together that no one outside can quite understand. For the rest of their lives, the people of Smet would mark time by the winter. Before the hard winter, after the hard winter. It became the fixed point in their memory, the thing everything else was measured against. And the women of the town, the ones who had done the grinding and the twisting and the rationing in every house, not just the Ingalls house, carried the same invisible thing Carolyn carried, the same quiet ledger, the same understanding that what they had done had kept everyone alive, and that no one was going to make a story of it. That is what the winter took that does not show up in any list of the dead. It took something out of the body of everyone who lived through it, and it left something in them, a watchfulness, a permanent awareness of how thin the line really is between a warm house and no house at all. That is the cost the soft version cannot show, because the soft version ends in May, on the morning of the rest of their lives. Before the bills came due, the winter was 7 months. The paying for it went on for decades, in a daughter's damaged lungs, in a father's spent vitality, in a mother's silent endurance, in in a family that had looked, together, into the real possibility of not surviving, and had come back from it changed in ways too quiet for a children's book to hold. They survived the long winter. They were never entirely free of it again, and yet somehow that winter, that catastrophic, marking, lifelong, bill-paying winter, became the thing we hand to children at bedtime, cosy, lamplit, resolved by the closing music. How did that happen? The answer is the whole reason this story needed telling, and it is not a villain. It is the gentle, understandable way that survival becomes legend, and legend smooths the survival away. So how did one of the deadliest winters the Northern Plains ever recorded turn into something we hand to children at bedtime? The answer is the whole reason this story needed telling. And it is not a villain. It is the gentle, understandable way that survival becomes legend, and legend smooths the survival away. It began with the book itself in 1940, when Laura, in her early 70s, set the winter down. She wrote it for children, and so she wrote it survivable, with the fear managed and the hunger bearable and the ending warm. Because that is what writing for children requires, and because that is perhaps also how a person needs to remember the worst thing that ever happened to them in order to live alongside the memory. She did not lie. She softened. She kept Pa steady and Ma calm, and put the small mercies where the fear would otherwise have been, and gave the whole ordeal the shape of an adventure survived, rather than a catastrophe barely escaped. And because she wrote it so well, her softened version became the version. It became, for millions of people, the long winter, more real than the real one. Then came the television show decades later, and it softened what was already soft the way television does, until the frontier itself became a warm and tidy place where hardship arrived in tidy episodes and resolved by the closing music. And so the cultural memory of the long winter settled into something cosy, a family pulling together by lamplight, a brave young man on a sled, a Christmas in May, a story about the strength of family with the terror taken out, and the women vanished into it. This is the quiet cost of the softening, the one worth naming as the story closes. When a catastrophe becomes a legend, the legend keeps the parts that make a clean story, the brave deed, the steady father, the happy ending, and it loses the parts that do not, which are mostly the parts the women did. The wheat run survives in the legend because it is an afternoon with a hero in it. Carolyn's 7 months of grinding and twisting and rationing and watching and not breaking do not survive, because they are not an afternoon, and there is no single hero to pin them on, and so they fade into the word housework, and the word vanishes into the background. The legend remembers the man who rode through the storm. It forgets the woman who, every one of those days, kept the people in the house alive long enough for the wheat to matter. That is not Laura's fault, or the show's, or anyone's. It is just what legends do. They keep the bright, clear shapes and lose the long grey labour. And the long grey labour on the frontier was almost always a woman's. The long winter is remembered as a story about survival. It is, more truly, a story about who actually does the surviving, in the rooms where there is no audience, and how rarely they are the ones the story ends up being about, and the person who decided how the whole world would remember this winter, the person who chose what to keep and what to soften, was herself, a 13-year-old girl in that house, twisting hay, watching her little sister fade, carrying the fear the book would later almost entirely erase. We have not looked at her directly yet. It is time we did. There is one more person in that house we have not yet looked at directly, and it is the one who would, in the end, decide how the whole world remembered the winter. Laura was 13. 13 is a hard age to live through something like that, because it is the age of understanding without power. Grace at 3 was too young to grasp the danger, and so was spared the worst of the fear. Laura was not. She was old enough to do the arithmetic of the food and the fuel right alongside her parents, old enough to see her little sister fading and to know what it meant, old enough to understand that the trains might not come in time, and that people did die of winters like this, and she was also still a child, still dependent, still without any real power to change any of it. All she could do was what the women of that house did, which was work and watch and not let the fear out where it would frighten the younger ones. so she carried. She was the strong daughter, the one who could keep up with Pa, and that winter her strength was spent on the endless labour that kept them alive. She twisted hay until her hands were raw, the same raw hands that months later would catch on the embroidery silks from the Christmas barrel. She took her turns at the mill until her arms gave out, and then took more. She helped tend Mary, and mind Grace, and stretched the work of survival across one more day. The book she would later write softens her own fear almost out of existence, the way it softens her mother's, but you can feel it underneath, in the very fact of how carefully she controls the telling. A person who was never frightened does not need to manage the memory so gently. And here is the thing that makes Laura, 13, worth pausing on. That winter did not just nearly kill her family, it made the writer. The girl twisting hay in that cold room was taking in, without knowing it, every detail she would spend the back half of her life setting down. The sound of the wind, the look of the frost on the walls, the taste of the coarse brown bread, the silence where the fiddle should have been. 60 years later, when she finally wrote it, the accuracy that startled the meteorologist came from this, from a 13-year-old who lived it so intensely that it never left her. The long winter survived as a book because it first survived as a wound, in a child who could not stop turning it over. So when we say the book is the soft version, we should say the rest of it too. It is the soft version because a grown woman chose, decades on, to spare the children who would read it the full weight of what the girl had actually carried. The softening was a gift, given by someone who had earned the right to give it, who had been there at 13 in the cold, and had decided that the world's children did not need to feel all of it the way she had. That is its own kind of love. It is just not the same thing as the truth. And the truth, which is what we owe these people now, is heavier than the gift. And the heaviness is the point. And there was one more person in that house, the one who did the least and remembered the least, and is, for that exact reason, the purest measure of what the whole effort was for, the baby, who slept through the worst winter the plains ever recorded, and walked out the far side of it remembering nothing, because a ring of exhausted women stood between her and the cold, and did not step aside. And then there was Grace, who was 3. It is easy to leave the baby out of a survival story, because the baby does the least and remembers the least. And Grace would carry no clear memory of the winter at all into the life that came after, but the littlest one is worth stopping on, precisely because she is the purest version of what the whole effort was for. Everything the women did in that house, every twisted hay stick and ground cup of wheat and evened out portion, was, at bottom, the protection of the ones who could not protect themselves. And no one in that house could protect herself less than Grace. A small child cannot ration herself. She cannot understand why the food is less today, or be reasoned into needing fewer calories because the trains have stopped. She only knows that she is cold, and that she is hungry, and that the grown-ups will fix it, because the grown-ups always fix it. The faith of a small child that the world will hold is total. And it is also, in a winter like that, a terrible weight to be on the other end of. Because someone has to be the reason that faith turns out to be justified. Someone has to make sure the cold child gets warm and the hungry child gets fed no matter what the arithmetic says. And to do it so steadily that the child never learns how close it came. Never has her faith that the world will hold so much as scratched. That someone, again, was Caroline. And the sisters who helped her. Keeping a toddler alive and warm and unafraid through months of blockade is not a smaller job than the wheat run. It is a larger one, because it never ends, and because it has to be done while hiding from its object the very danger that makes it necessary. Grace came through the long winter remembering nothing of it, and that, far from making her unimportant to the story, is the story's quiet triumph. The measure of what the women did is precisely that the youngest among them walked out the far side of the deadliest winter on record with no scar on her at all, not even a memory, because the people around her had absorbed the whole of it so that she would not have to. That is what survival looked like in the end for the most protected person in that house. Not an adventure remembered, but a danger never known. The baby slept through the worst winter the plains ever recorded, warm enough and fed enough, because a ring of exhausted women stood between her and the cold, and did not step aside. It is the most invisible kind of heroism there is, the kind whose whole success is measured in a child who never finds out she was in danger. And it is, more than the sled and the storm, what the long winter was actually made of. And before we follow the snow into the water, it is worth telling the story of the men who tried and failed to keep the line open, because their failure is the reason the blockade happened at all. And because it was not, in the end, a failure of effort. Some winters are bigger than the trying, and all that is left when the lifeline fails is the slow, unglamorous business of surviving on whatever you have, which the women in the houses had been doing all along. It is worth telling the story of the men who tried and failed to keep the line open, because their failure is the reason the blockade happened at all, and because it was not, in the end, a failure of effort. The railroad was the town's single thread to survival, and the railroad knew it, and the railroad fought. Through November and December, as the storms stacked the snow into the cuts, the company sent crews out to dig the line clear, men with shovels and horses and the heavy wedge ploughs of the day, pushing into drifts that had set up nearly as hard as the ice. It was savage, dangerous work, performed in the same killing cold that was besieging the towns, by men who were themselves a long way from warmth and food. They would open a cut, run a train through, and turn around to find the next storm had already begun to close it behind them. They dug the same stretches of line over and over, and the winter undid their work as fast as they could do it, and sometimes faster. There is a kind of despair in fighting a thing that simply will not be beaten, and that is what the line crews were doing. A plough can break through a drift. It cannot break through a winter. By January, the arithmetic that had broken every family in every town had broken the railroad too. The effort it took to move a single train had grown so enormous, and the result so quickly erased that going on made no sense. And so the company made its terrible rational decision. It stopped. It pulled the crews off the line and announced no more trains until spring, and in doing so it formally handed the towns their sentence. We tend to imagine, when a lifeline fails, that someone gave up too easily. That more effort would have saved the day. The long winter does not offer that comfort. The men of the line tried as hard as men can try, and the winter beat them anyway, the way it was beating everyone, and the towns were left on their own, not because anyone abandoned them lightly, but because the thing they were all up against was simply larger than human effort could overcome. That is the hardest truth the winter teaches, and it is the one the cozy version cannot hold. That sometimes the trains do not come, not because no one tried, but because some winters are bigger than the trying, and all that is left when the lifeline fails is the slow, unglamorous business of surviving on whatever you have, which the women in the houses had been doing all along. And then, at last, the winter broke. The snow began to soften, the trains began to move. The town allowed itself for the first time in months to believe the danger was finally over. It was not. For many on the northern plains, the deadliest part of the hard winter was not the winter at all, it was the thaw. And here is the part of the story almost no one knows, the part that should end any notion that the danger broke when the spring came. For many on the northern plains, the deadliest part of the hard winter was not the winter at all, it was the thaw. Think about how much snow 7 months of unbroken blizzards leaves on the land. It had not melted between storms, it had only stacked, deeper and deeper, across an entire region, all winter long, an immense weight of frozen water lying on the prairie and packed into every low place and river valley. And then, when the season finally turned, all of it tried to become water at once. The melt came faster than the still frozen ground could absorb, faster than the ice-choked rivers could carry. The rivers jammed with broken ice and overran their banks. Water rose where no one expected water. Riverside towns that had survived the entire winter were flooded and battered, and in places washed away. By more than one account, the floods that followed the hard winter took more lives than the long blockade of the winter itself had. There is a cruel design in that, and it is worth sitting with as this story moves toward its close. The families who endured the worst the winter could throw at them, the cold, the hunger, the dark, the months of blockade, and who allowed themselves, at the first warm day, to believe the danger was finally over, were exactly the families the flood then came for. They had braced against the wrong ending. They had survived the thing they could see coming, and were undone by the thing they could not. The quiet consequence of all that survived snow turning, in a few warm days, into a wall of water. The Ingallses, for their part, came through the thaw as they had come through the winter, alive. But the wider truth of the season is in those floods, and it is this. The hard winter did not end in a Christmas in May. It ended in drowned towns, and a death toll no one ever fully counted. In a final, almost mocking blow delivered to people who thought the worst was behind them. The book ends in warmth and light because the book is about one family and one town that the water happened to spare. The history ends in cold water rising over the people who had just survived the cold, and it is a darker and a truer ending, and it is the one we owe these settlers now, more than a century after the snow that nearly buried them all finally, lethally, melted. The water receded, the ground dried. The survivors, thinner and more marked than they had been the autumn before, did the only thing there was to do, begin again. And the winter, which was over, on the calendar, kept taking its quiet instalments from them for the rest of their lives. What happened after, to the people and the town, is worth a little of our time, because survival is not the same as recovery, and the difference is part of the truth. When the trains came back and the floods receded, the survivors of the hard winter did the only thing there was to do, which was begin again. The seed wheat that had been ground into bread all winter was by its nature the seed for the next crop, and now there was less of it to plant. And a planting season shortened by the late hard spring. The town that had nearly starved had to feed itself forward into another year on what the winter had left it, which was not much. There was no relief fund, no aid convoy, no outside reckoning of what these towns had endured. There was only the next season's work, taken up by people who were thinner and more tired and more marked than they had been the autumn before, and who now knew, in a way they had not known in the easy months, exactly what the country they had bet their lives on was capable of. Smet itself survived, and grew, and became, in time, the town the books made famous, the place readers still travel to. The Ingallses stayed on, and lived out much of the rest of their family story there, and the Smet cemetery is where most of them now lie. Charles in 1902, Caroline in 1924, Mary in 1938, after decades of quiet endurance in the dark. Carrie in 1946, the winter still in her lungs. Grace in 1941. Laura herself, far away in Missouri, in 1957, having outlived nearly everyone she loved and left behind the books that would keep them all alive in the memory of millions. The railroad that had failed them learned the lesson, and built against the next bad winter, with snow fences and better ploughs and stores laid by. The way people always armour themselves, a little too late, against the last disaster. The hard winter became, for the region, the measuring stick against which every hard winter afterward was judged and found milder. Old people spoke of it for the rest of their lives the way people speak of a war they had been in. But the deeper thing the spring revealed is that the winter never fully let go of the ones it spared. Carrie carried it in her lungs. Charles carried it in a vitality the family felt had been spent and not replaced. And all of them carried it in the simple, unspoken knowledge that they had looked, together, into the real possibility of not surviving, and had come back. A family that has done that is never quite the same easy family again. There is a soberness under everything after, a closeness born of shared fear, a permanent awareness of how thin the line really is. The spring brought the green prairie back, and the warmth back, and the food back. It did not bring back the people they had been in the autumn, before they learned what a Dakota winter could do. Those people stayed in the snow. Which brings us, at last, back to where we came in, to the soft version, and to the question of what we owe these people, now that we know the rest of it. You came to this knowing the long winter, the blizzards, the hay sticks, the brown bread, the fiddle, the brave ride for the wheat, the Christmas finally come in May. You knew the soft version, because the soft version is the only one most of the world was ever given. Now you know the rest of it. You know that it was not a cosy hardship, but one of the deadliest winters the northern plains have on record. A regional catastrophe that buried towns from horizon to horizon, and killed more people in the floods that followed than in the long blockade itself. With a death toll no one ever fully counted. You know that the train stopped in January and did not return until May, and that a whole town spent those months one short summer away from starving in the dark. You know that the family came closer to losing the smallest of them than the book ever admits, and that the winter reached into a frail 10-year-old named Carrie and took a piece of her health that it kept for the next 65 years. You know that the legend went to the men who rode out for an afternoon, and that the survival, the real, daily, 7-month survival, belonged to the women who never stopped, and got no legend at all. You know that Mary, the blind sister, took the whole winter on sound and cold and faith, that the baby, Grace, slept through it, warm enough, because a ring of exhausted women stood between her and the dark, that Laura, at 13, took in every detail that would, 60 years later, become the book, and that the book's softness was a gift she gave to other people's children, because she did not want them to feel what she had. And you know, most of all, the name that the soft version leaves at the edge of the frame, Laura Ingalls. Caroline, whose father drowned on Lake Michigan when she was 5. Carolyn, who grew up in a household so close to the edge that she learned in her body never to fall apart. Carolyn, who married a restless man and absorbed the cost of every dream he chased. Carolyn, who had already buried a baby and survived grasshopper plagues, and watched her eldest daughter go blind before the worst winter of her life even began. Carolyn, who ground the wheat and twisted the hay and stretched the food and watched the weak ones and held the family spirit together through 7 months that broke stronger things. And who did it the way she did everything, without spectacle, without complaint, and without ever being made the hero of the story she was in fact holding up. The book remembers Pa's steadiness and Almanzo's ride. The record remembers a woman who had been tempered by her own hard childhood into the one instrument that winter required, and who did not lay the burden down, and who was therefore the reason any of them lived to make a book of it at all. The long winter ended in May, with a train and a turkey and a Christmas months out of its season. That is where Laura kindly chose to leave it. But the truer ending is the one the records keep, and it is colder, and it is this. They survived. They were marked for life by surviving. And the person most responsible for the survival was given, for her trouble, the smallest part in the story it became. That is the frontier underneath the soft version. It made the men into legends and the winters into adventures, and it ran the whole time on the unbroken labour of women whose names the legend had no room for. The fiddle went quiet that winter. The woman who kept the house never did, and the world remembered the music. If this version of the winter landed different from the one you grew up with, if there is a woman in your own family whose quiet, unbroken labour is the reason the rest of you are here, and whose name never got the chapter it deserved, leave her name in the comments, or just say it out loud, where you are, right now. She earned that. If you want the sources, the 2020 meteorological study, the 2013 pediatrics paper on Mary's blindness, the railroad logs, the Pioneer Girl annotated biography, they are linked below. And if you want the other stories the soft versions kept from you, the women the legends left out, the winters the book softened, the bodies that carried the cost, that is what this channel is for. Subscribe if you want the next one, or don't. Either way, you know the rest of it now.